We are now being joined by Bill Browder, author of the books Red Notice and Freezing Over, and leader of the global Magnitsky Justice Campaign. Good afternoon, Mr. Browder.
Hello.
Thank you for finding the time. I wanted to first ask you about the decision to remove Oleg Tinkov from the sanctions list. As far as I understand, you made an intervention on his behalf, according to what he wrote on his Instagram. Is this the case?
Oleg Tinkov was one of the few Russian businessmen who actively spoke out against the war in Ukraine, criticized Putin. And Oleg Tinkov paid a price for that, which was the effective expropriation of his bank. And so I'm generally not very sympathetic to most Russian businessmen. In fact, I think there's very few that I have sympathy for. But the fact that he was willing to take a personal risk and to speak out against the regime, and as a result, pay a hefty penalty of having to sell his bank at, I think, 2% of its value to Vladimir Putin, suggests that he's not a Putin crony. And so I think that their decision is a just decision.
You supported his petition to lift sanctions against him. How did that process work? Could you describe the mechanism of how it takes place? As I'm sure lots of people in the Russian Federation would like to know.
Каким образом можно выйти из-под санкций?
I was never actively involved in any part of his application. I'm just a commentator about this. I didn't play any role in his sanctions lifting process, but I do think that he was one of the few people who did speak out against the war, and then for that I think he doesn't deserve to be punished in the way that other oligarchs who have kept their head down are being punished.
Tinkov also says that he was supported in the sanction lifting process by Khodorkovsky and Navalny. It's an interesting group of people. Do you know anything about it?
I only know what I've read in the newspapers, and so I have no inside knowledge on who was behind him and who was against him in this process.
Mr. Browder, at the same time as Oleg Tinkov's sanctions were lifted, Mr. Alexei Kudrin, a very well-known figure in Russia who was previously Minister of Finance and now works for Yandex, and before that even spoke at the protests in Bolotnaya Square, was included in the sanctions list. How do you feel about this?
Как вы к этому относитесь?
Well, so I can only speak from my own personal experience, but Alexei Kudrin was the Minister of Finance at the time when Sergei Magnitsky exposed a $230 million tax rebate fraud, which was the largest tax rebate fraud that was committed in the history of Russia. It was under Alexei Kudrin's watch that $230 million was illegally refunded to a bunch of criminals and corrupt officials. And I can't imagine that money was refunded to those individuals without his knowledge. I can't imagine that he was sitting there as the Minister of Finance and all that money was leaving the Ministry of Finance and he didn't know. And furthermore, he did nothing after the crime was exposed to try to get that money back, to call for prosecutions, etc. So while there are some people that are saying that Alexei Kudrin was a good guy, that he's a westernized person, etc., I see him as just being a better English-speaking voice of a very evil regime, which is the Putin regime.
He was even mentioned when Bard College was declared to be an undesirable organization, as he'd worked with them and made connections between Bard College and St. Petersburg State University. But despite him pleading their case, they were still recognized as an undesirable organization, even before the start of the full-scale war. And I can't help but mention that today TV Rain was recognized as undesirable. To continue on the topic of sanctions, I'd like to know your opinion on Ekaterina Isinbayeva, the Olympic pole vaulting champion. She's currently a very hot topic of debate in Russia. Do you think she should be sanctioned?
Она заслуживает включения в санкционные списки?
Well, I'm not an expert on her, but from the superficial knowledge I have, that she was a supporter of Putin, that she was a somebody who's been very helpful to the regime, and so anybody who's been helpful to the regime is in my mind not a welcome person in the West.
If I can zoom out a little bit and ask about the general sanctions program undertaken since the start of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, do you think it's working? Because the answer isn't immediately obvious.
Ответ не очевиден на самом деле.
Well, sanctions have two possible roles. They can either be a deterrent or they can be a punishment. And the sanctions have never been all that actively used up until the Putin's murderous invasion of Ukraine. And for 22 years, the West sort of turned a blind eye and didn't use the sanctions. And so the sanctions haven't been a very good deterrent because they were never used in advance. If Putin had thought that he would be suffering from these types of sanctions before he invaded Ukraine, he might have been deterred from invading Ukraine. So it hasn't worked as a deterrent. And then the question is, are sanctions working as a punishment? And here, I think the sanctions are working, but they're not strong enough. So we have seen that about $350 billion of central bank reserves are frozen. That's good. And we've seen that about 40 of the top 118 oligarchs have had their money frozen. That's good. We've seen that the commercial banks and the Russian central bank can't go to the international capital markets. That's also good. But what we don't see is that Russia continues to make a huge amount of money from the sale of oil and gas, and that money is being used to fund the war in Ukraine. And so the West, if the West really wants to get serious with Russia, the West should cut off the money that's going in for the sale of oil and gas by an oil embargo of some sort. And of course, the West doesn't want to do that because the price of oil would then go up and harm inflation issues in other countries, et cetera. So the sanctions are working, but the sanctions need to be broadened. And as long as Putin continues to receive money in Russia to fund this war, the sanctions won't have worked as well as they should have.
Finally, given that you say that sanctions have not been completely effective, we started our conversation by talking about Oleg Tinkov, against whom sanctions were lifted by the British authorities. Are you aware of any other Russians, business people or other, who you think deserve to have the sanctions against them lifted?
Well, as one of the people who's been most responsible for lobbying Western governments to impose sanctions, I don't spend a lot of time on who's unfairly sanctioned. I spend much more time on saying who hasn't been sanctioned. And as I mentioned, there's about 40 of the top 118 oligarchs.
Who, in your opinion, should be placed on the sanctions list right now?
Well, so here's what I would say is very simple. You get the Forbes list of 118 oligarchs, and you look at who's been sanctioned, and you look at who hasn't been sanctioned, and there's about 60 oligarchs who haven't been sanctioned. And I'm of the opinion that it's not possible to be rich businessman in Russia without the permission and coordination with the government and with Putin. And therefore, I think all of the people who are not on the sanctions list, who are on the Forbes list, should be added to that sanctions list.
Got it. Thank you very much. That was William Browder, author of the books Red Notice and Freezing Over, and leader of the global Magnitsky Justice Campaign.
We operated in Russia for 12 years, and the government tried to get rid of us 3 times.
We had to leave, forced out of the country by new repressive laws after the first week of the war. Our freedom crushed by the authorities.
Мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We survived, started working from Europe, and now we are watched by millions of people every day.
There's no other independent news channel in Russian. We have now decided to tell the truth about Russia in English as well.
So that you could get news about Russia, the war in Ukraine, and Russian society directly from the source.
We want to tell you firsthand what is really happening in Russia. Subscribe to TVRain Newsroom on YouTube and let's take a look at our future together.